All right, let's jump right in. We're going to start this deep dive with something that, on the surface, sounds almost childishly simple.
Right.
But I promise you, it's actually one of the deepest uh, conceptual traps in
Yeah.
all of philosophy.
Yeah.
And it determines how you see reality itself.
It absolutely does. The trap is sprung the moment we use a single word like red to describe two totally different things.
Two different categories of being, really.
Exactly. A measurable property of a physical thing on one hand, and an internal subjective quality of an experience on the other. That mix-up is the root of so much confusion.
And our mission today is to clear up that confusion. We want to take these ideas, color, perception, even what it means to be alive, and get to a place of real conceptual clarity.
We're basically building a new toolkit for you, the listener.
A new toolkit, that's a great way to put it. The goal here is to help you shift your whole framework away from what we're going to call an additive view of reality.
The additive view being this idea that you start with a dead, lifeless world, and then you somehow, bolt on consciousness or experience later.
Exactly. We want to move from that to a constitutive one. And if we do this right, you'll walk away with the ability to spot these fundamental errors in almost any debate you come across.
Whether it's about the hard problem of consciousness or if an AI could ever be sentient, these are the foundational tools you need.
And the sources we're diving into today are perfect for this. They're all about this process of disambiguating our terms.
Right, cleaning up the language to avoid these conceptual contradictions and pseudo-problems, as the philosophers say.
And that cleanup isn't just for academic exercise. It leads to a really profound insight that is kind of a whole point of our deep dive.
Which is that liveliness should not be understood as something that is added to an otherwise lifeless world, but as a constitutive, perspectival mode of organization of reality.
That's a huge statement. It sounds very dense.
It is, and we're going to spend the rest of our time building the case for why that shift in thinking isn't just interesting, it's methodologically necessary.
So let's start with the first tool we need, the one that underpins everything else, the category mistake. In German, it's the Kategorienfehler.
Right.
Before we even get to color, we have to get our heads around this. So what is it, in simple terms?
A category mistake, at its core, is when you talk about something as if it belongs to one category of things when it actually belongs to a completely different one.
Okay, so it's like putting something in the wrong box.
It's like trying to find the wrong type of thing in the wrong type of place, and the result isn't just being wrong about a fact.
Right. I mean, if I say the Eiffel Tower is in Berlin, that's just a factual error. I'm wrong, you can correct me, this is something different.
Much, much deeper. The result of a category mistake is a statement that can sound perfectly fine grammatically, a well-formed sentence.
Sure.
But when you actually analyze it, it's substantively nonsensical. The original German is great here. Sachlich unsinnig.
Sachlich unsinnig. So, nonsensical in its substance. What's the real difference between that and just, a silly question?
A silly question usually has a clear answer the person just missed. A substantively nonsensical question is a trap. The words themselves can't logically connect.
Can you give us a classic example?
Of course. The classic one is asking, how much does the number 7 weigh?
Okay, yeah. Grammatically, that sentence is perfect. Subject, verb, object, no problem there. But the question is just meaningless.
It's meaningless because the concept 7 belongs to the category of abstract ideas.
And weight belongs to the category of physical objects with mass.
Exactly. The two categories cannot be mapped onto each other. It's not that we don't have a good enough scale to weigh the number 7. The question itself is incoherent. Trying to answer it saying it weighs 2 pounds is just making the same mistake all over again.
So it's not about being true or false. It's about whether the statement is even coherent in the first place. That's the real distinction.
That's the key, and it generates these conceptual contradictions. Another great example from our sources is about pain. You might ask, is the pain in your knee located 2 inches to the left of your kneecap?
We talk like that all the time. The pain is in my shoulder.
We do. But pain belongs to the category of experience. Physical location belongs to the category of spatial objects. The experience of pain is realized by nerves in that area, but the pain itself doesn't occupy a specific coordinate in space.
Treating it like it does, like it's a little object you could find with a ruler, that's the mistake.
That is the mistake, and it leads to pseudo-problems you can waste centuries on.
Which brings us to why this is so important. Why do we need to be so rigorous about this?
Because in any serious discussion, especially about the mind, consciousness, reality, making these distinctions is, as our sources say, methodologically necessary.
Not just useful, necessary.
Necessary. The moment you let categories get mixed up, you are guaranteed to generate conceptual contradictions and pseudo-problems.
And these pseudo-problems are dangerous because they feel like real unsolvable mysteries, don't they?
They do. So many of the great intractable problems in philosophy are actually just artifacts of bad categorization from the start. The classic mind-body problem is a perfect example.
How so?
Well, if you start by categorizing the mind as one type of thing and the body as another type of thing, you've immediately created the problem of how these two totally different things can possibly interact.
You created the problem with your first move.
You did. So by using the category mistake analysis, you don't solve the mind-body problem.
You dissolve it.
You dissolve it. You show that the question itself was built on a flawed premise, that the mind was never a thing in that category to begin with.
That is the power of this tool. It clears away the conceptual clutter so you can ask the real questions.
Precisely. And if we treat something like the feeling of red as if it were a physical property of an apple, we are setting ourselves up for exactly that kind of confusion.
Which is the perfect segue. Let's apply this tool to the problem of color. Okay, color. It feels so obvious, so simple. I'm looking at my desk, it's brown. I look at my screen, it's white. But the second you ask, what is that brownness? That's where the trouble starts.
Immediately. Because you're trying to define something that exists in two completely different domains. You have to pull apart the metaphysical framework from the experiential one.
Let's start with the older view, the classical Aristotelian way of thinking. How do they categorize color?
In classical metaphysics, color is an accident. An accident.
An accident, like a mistake.
No, in the philosophical sense. It means a property that an object has, but that isn't essential to what that object is.
Okay, unpack that.
Non-essential.
Think of an apple.
Hmm?
Its essential properties might be fruit of a tree, contains seeds made of plant cells. Those things define it as an apple.
Right.
Its color, red, green, whatever, is certainly a property of the apple. It depends on the apple. But if you could magically turn a red apple blue, it would still be an apple.
Its appleness wouldn't change. Exactly. So the color is a non-essential, dependent property, an accident.
Okay, so that framework puts color out there in the world attached to the object.
Firmly.
But then, modern philosophy, epistemology, phenomenology, they come along and completely flip that, don't they?
They flip it entirely. The definition gets inverted. Color is no longer defined by its relation to the object. It's defined by its relation to the experiencer.
So it becomes an experiential quality, a quale.
A quale, yes. Plural, qualia. That's the famous term for the raw, subjective feeling of an experience, the what it's likeness.
So what it's like to see red or taste salt or feel cold.
That's right. And this is where the subjective reality of color lives. So we've conceptually moved color from out there on the apple to in here in the conscious system.
And that's the jump. That's where the potential for a massive category mistake comes in. If you confuse the accidents out there with the quale in here.
You're making the error every single time. And it happens constantly, especially when we talk about physics and light.
So let's draw that line as sharply as we possibly can. When a physicist talks about red light, what are they actually physically talking about?
From a pure physics perspective, they are only talking about wavelength.
Okay.
Wavelength is a measurable property of electromagnetic radiation. It's objective, you can measure it in nanometers, an instrument can detect it. It's purely in the domain of physics.
Is the concept of color anywhere in the equations of physics?
Absolutely not. And this is the crucial point our sources drive home. The word color does not describe a feature of the radiation itself. Radiation just has a frequency and a wavelength. That's it.
So when a scientist says, we shone a red light on the sample, what are they really saying philosophically?
They're using what our sources call a practical shorthand. A verkursende praxisnijredderwijs.
A practical shortened way of speaking.
Right. It's a useful shortcut. But what they mean is we used light with a wavelength of, say, 700 nanometers, which, when it interacts with a typical human visual system, produces the experience we call red.
So when I look at a sunset and say, wow, the sky is a brilliant orange, I am fundamentally not describing a property of the photons.
You're not. The photons are just electromagnetic waves of a certain frequency. The orangeness is the experience being generated inside your perceptual system.
Which leads us to that core, non-negotiable insight.
Without perceiving systems, there are no colors, only radiation.
Say it again.
Without perceiving systems, there are no colors, only radiation. If you took every conscious, experiencing being out of the universe, the sun would still emit radiation, objects would still reflect it, but the quality we call color would be gone. It would have conceptually vanished.
That is a very difficult thing for most of us to accept, I think. We're so wired to believe that the color is a property of the thing itself, just like its shape or its weight.
That is the category mistake we learn in the crib. It takes real philosophical effort to pull those two concepts apart: the object's disposition to reflect light and the subject's experience of color.
Okay, this distinction is so important. And for anyone still struggling with it, for anyone who wants to insist that color really is just a physical property, the phenomenon of synesthesia is, well, it's the ultimate test case.
It really is. It forces the issue because it breaks the normal link we learn between a specific stimulus and a specific sensory experience.
It proves that color has to be a property of the experience, not the input.
Exactly. So let's describe it. What's a common form of synesthesia?
Well, the one that's most relevant here is when someone hears sounds and sees colors.
Right. A person hears a piece of music and they literally, genuinely see colors or shapes moving in their mind's eye. A certain note on a piano might always be a particular shade of deep blue. A violin might produce streaks of silver.
So for a person with this neurological wiring, when they say this music is blue, they are not being poetic.
Not at all. It's not a metaphor. It is a direct, truthful, accurate description of their phenomenal reality.
But to an outsider, to a philosopher who doesn't know about synesthesia, that statement, this music is blue, looks like a textbook category mistake.
It looks exactly like how much does the number 7 weigh? You're ascribing a visual property, color, to an auditory object, music.
So how do we make sense of it? How do we show it's not a mistake?
We use the precise definitions we just established. The synesthete is not making a claim about the physics of the sound waves.
Right. They're not saying the vibrations in the air are literally colored blue.
Of course not. They are reporting on the phenomenal property of their experience. They're describing their internal world, the structure of their perception. The color isn't in the sound. The color is in the experience of the sound.
So let's nail this down. Is the statement, this music is blue, a category mistake?
It is not a category mistake, as long as we understand it correctly.
As long as it's understood as a description of that person's subjective internal world.
Exactly. As a report on their structure of experience, it's a perfectly valid, coherent, and true statement.
So where would the mistake come in? When does it cross the line?
The category mistake only happens if that person, or someone analyzing them, claims that the music objectively possesses the color blue in a physical sense. If they were to insist that the sound waves themselves somehow carry blueness as a physical property like frequency?
That's the line. That's the attempt to illegitimately map an internal quality onto an external object.
That's the whole game. And because this distinction is so crucial and so easy to mess up, our sources insist on a formal method to keep it clean, a disambiguation protocol.
A protocol. I like that. So how does it work? How do we split our language to keep the science and the philosophy compatible?
We have to maintain 2 separate descriptive tracks, and we never, ever cross the streams.
Okay, track 1.
Track 1 is the objective description. This is pure physics, causality. You only use terms that are externally measurable, so you wouldn't say the apple is red.
You would say
the object has the disposition to reflect light of wavelength X.
disposition. That word is doing a lot of work there. It has the potential to cause an experience, but it's not the experience itself.
Precisely. That statement is purely about the object's physical properties. It's what science can measure.
In track 2.
Track 2 is the subjective description. This is the phenomenal report. Here you'd say, the subject experiences the color red under conditions Y.
And conditions Y could be anything.
It could be looking at an apple. It could be a synesthetic response to music. It could be a dream. It could be your imagination. The trigger doesn't matter. This track is only describing the internal state.
This protocol is powerful because it doesn't deny the reality of color. It just puts it in its proper place.
Exactly. It's a property of experience, not a property of the world. And by keeping these 2 tracks separate, you can suddenly describe all sorts of complex things, illusions, colorblindness, synesthesia, without any contradictions. Science stays on track 1, phenomenology stays on track 2, and you avoid the category mistakes that happen when you try to merge them.
Okay, we firmly placed color inside the subject as an experience. Now, to really drive this home, Let's take the external world out of the equation completely. Let's talk about imagination.
The perfect test case.
Because if color is just a response to light hitting an object, then how can I close my eyes right now and picture, I don't know, a bright yellow lemon? I can see it so vividly.
That very simple act tells us something absolutely critical about the mechanism of color experience. There's no lemon, there's no light of a specific wavelength hitting your retina,
Not at all.
and yet a genuine color experience is happening. It feels real.
The only possible conclusion, then, is that the experience has to be generated by purely internal neural process.
It has to be. It shows that color isn't just a passive reaction to the outside world, it's an active process. Your brain learned the connection between certain light waves and the experience of yellow when your eyes were open. It stored that pattern.
And now it can reactivate that pattern on its own without the original stimulus.
Exactly. So the color experience is an expression of a specific pattern of brain activity.
And right here, this is where the next big, tempting category mistake is waiting for us, isn't it? The trap of physical reductionism.
The biggest one. The temptation is to say, aha, we found it. The color is the brain activity. The experience of yellow is just neuron cluster B firing.
And you're saying that's a mistake.
That is the problematic identification. To say the color is a configuration in the brain is to confuse the thing that realizes the experience with the experience itself.
Okay, hold on. I need to push back on that because that's a subtle distinction. Why isn't it the same thing? If the neural activity causes the feeling, and without the activity there's no feeling, aren't they just two ways of describing the same event?
It's a fantastic question, and the distinction is subtle, but it's everything. Think of it this way. The neural activity, the firing of neurons, the chemical signals, that is all physical stuff.
Huh.
We can measure it with our instruments. It's described in terms of voltage and chemistry. The color, the yellowness, is the phenomenal state. It has a quality of what it's like. One belongs to the category of physical processes, the other to the category of phenomenal states.
Can you give me an analogy?
Sure. Think about software running on a computer. The software function, let's say a word processor, is realized by the electronic states of the silicon chips, the patterns of on and off transistors.
Right.
But the word processor is not the silicon chips. The function belongs to a different logical category than the physical hardware. The hardware enables the function, but it isn't identical to it.
I see. So the keywords are realizes or enables, not is. The brain activity realizes the color experience.
That distinction is the firewall that protects us from that reductionist category mistake.
Okay, so if it's the activity that realizes the experience, we need to look closer at what kind of activity we're talking about. It can't just be any old physical state in the brain.
No, absolutely not. And this is where we have to distinguish between a static physical state and the dynamic pattern required for experience.
What's a static state?
A static state is like a snapshot. You could say, at this exact millisecond, neuron X has a membrane potential of negative 70 millivolts. That's a structural fact. It's isolatable, momentary.
And that's not enough to be an experience.
It doesn't seem to be. Experience, especially something like seeing a rich, stable color, requires something more complex. It requires dynamic patterns of activity across whole networks of neurons.
Patterns that unfold over time.
Yes, and crucially, patterns that are context-dependent and learned.
What do you mean context-dependent?
Well, think about an optical illusion. You can have two patches on a screen that are reflecting the exact same physical wavelength of light to your eye.
But they look like two completely different colors because of the surrounding shapes and shadows.
Exactly. The physical input is identical. The experience is different. Why? Because the dynamic pattern of neural activity your brain generates to interpret the whole scene is different. The experience depends on the overall context, not just the raw input.
So it's not the wiring itself, it's the process that's running on the wiring. A process that's dynamic, that's learned from past experience, and that can be reactivated.
That is the crucial insight. And this specific kind of dynamic, perspectival, learned activity is what we are now going to use to build a new definition of liveliness. So now we have to make a very important conceptual pivot. We've established that experience requires this complex, dynamic, perspectival activity in the brain.
Right.
The next step is to get really precise about what makes that kind of activity different from other kinds of activity in the universe, like a clock ticking or a river flowing.
And you're saying the normal distinction we make, biological versus mechanical, isn't the right one here.
It's not the philosophically relevant one. We need to move away from thinking about the difference between a rabbit and a robot and start thinking about the difference in their dynamics.
So what are the two categories of activity we need to distinguish between to redefine this idea of liveliness?
The fundamental split is between merely functionally described activity on the one hand and phenomenally experienced activity on the other.
And the line between them is?
The presence of a subjective perspective.
Okay, let's break that down. Merely functionally described activity. That's most things, right? A car engine, a computer running code.
Yes. A sophisticated thermostat is a great example. It takes an input, temperature, it processes it through a causal mechanism, and it produces an output, turn on the heat. We can describe everything it does completely and exhaustively in the language of mechanics and algorithms. We never have to ask, what does it feel like to be that thermostat? The question makes no sense.
But the second we talk about seeing the color red, as a quail, as an experience, we've crossed the line.
You've crossed the line.
Yeah.
Because now you are talking about activity that has a subjective perspective. It has an inside view. There's a what it's like to be that system undergoing that activity. And that perspective is the non-negotiable ingredient for experience.
And you're saying that this specific kind of perspectival activity is, as far as we know, only found in living things.
Right now, yes. It is currently known to us only in living beings.
I have to pause on that. When you say known to us, are you closing the door on, say, a highly advanced AI ever having experiences? Are you saying it has to be biological?
No, and that is a critical point. We are trying to be philosophically precise and open. The statement is about our current state of knowledge, not a final statement about all of reality. The category itself is defined by perspectival organization, not by biology.
So if we ever built a machine out of silicon that could be proven to have this kind of perspectival dynamic activity,
Then we would simply say that the category of things with perspectival organization now includes that machine. The definition of the category doesn't change, just what we know fits into it. The key isn't the substrate flesh or silicon, it's the nature of the organization.
that makes sense. And it means for this conversation, we have to kind of put aside our everyday common sense idea of what life is.
We absolutely have to. The common definition based on metabolism, reproduction, being a plant or an animal, it's just too clumsy for this kind of philosophical work. It's an obstacle.
So things like, does it have mitochondria? Does it photosynthesize? That's all irrelevant to this specific question.
Totally irrelevant. The refined focus, the only thing that matters for this distinction, is experiencing activity versus merely causally unfolding activity.
Does the process have an internal point of view? A subjective dimension?
Or is it just a chain of physical events, one domino knocking over the next, that could be fully described from the outside without missing anything? A rock eroding is merely causally unfolding. A computer program is, as far as we know, merely causally unfolding.
The difference is that phenomenal dimension. Does the activity matter to the system itself from the inside?
That is the requirement. The presence of that perspectival organization is what we are now philosophically calling liveliness.
And that precision lets us tie this all together. We can finally formulate that statement we were aiming for.
We can. Color experience is not a property of an object, it's not a static snapshot of a brain state, and it's not just machine-like activity. It is precisely an aspect of perspectival conscious dynamics.
That's so clean. It takes the word life out of it entirely
Yeah.
and replaces it with a description of the kind of process it is, a process organized around a perspective.
And now, with all that groundwork laid, we can finally make the big move. We can tackle the main goal of this deep dive, which is shifting from that old additive model of reality to a constitutive one.
This is the payoff. Let's really spend some time on this additive model, because it's the default setting for how most of us think about the world, even if we don't realize it.
It is the default, and it's built on a foundational assumption, a fallacy, really. It assumes that the universe is, at its base level, made of completely lifeless, non-experiential stuff.
Brute matter.
Just physical particles bouncing around with no point of view.
Exactly. And then the model says at some point in history when that matter got complicated enough, something new, life, mind, experience was added to it. Like adding a magic ingredient. This is where you get ideas like the spark of life or the ghost in the machine.
Precisely. The hidden equation is always matter plus X experience. And for centuries, that X was maybe a soul or some other non-physical thing.
And today we call that X the hard problem of consciousness or the explanatory gap.
Right. But the structure of the problem is the same. And this additive framework creates a whole host of problems that are basically unsolvable.
Okay, what's the first one?
The emergence problem. If your starting ingredients, matter, are fundamentally non-perspectival, how on earth does a perspective just suddenly emerge from them? How do you get subjectivity from pure objectivity? It feels like pulling a rabbit out of a hat.
It violates the principle that you can't get more out of a system than you put into it.
And second, you have the explanatory gap. Even if we map every single neuron firing to every single subjective feeling, we're still left with a gap. We can see the correlation, but we can't explain why the physical stuff should feel like anything at all. The additive model creates that gap by assuming the stuff was dead to begin with.
And the third problem is that you always end up flirting with dualism.
Always, because if the matter can't explain the experience, then that mysterious X starts to look a lot like a non-physical ghost that you have to attach to the machine to make it run. The model forces you to look for a ghost.
So we're stuck trying to bridge a gap that we ourselves created with our first assumption, that the universe was fundamentally lifeless.
Yes. The entire problem is an artifact of the framework, which is why we need to throw out the framework.
And replace it with the alternative, the constitutive shift.
A more demanding, but I think more coherent position. It says that liveliness, the capacity for experience from a perspective, is not something added to a lifeless world. It's a fundamental mode of being or organization for certain kinds of reality.
Okay, the word fundamental is going to scare some people. It sounds like you're saying it's magic or supernatural.
We have to be so clear about this. Fundamental here does not mean mystical or anti-science. It's a term about deduction.
What do you mean?
When we say something is fundamental in physics, like space-time or quantum fields, we just mean you can't reduce it to anything simpler. You can't explain space-time in terms of something else. It's a basic feature of the world.
So when you say perspectival organization is fundamental, you just mean it's a basic way reality can be structured. You can't explain it away in non-perspectival terms without losing the very thing you're trying to explain.
Exactly. It's constitutive, not derivative. It's built in, not bolted on. We stop asking, how does dead matter create a perspective? And we start with the premise that some forms of reality are, from the outset, organized perspectively.
So the equation isn't matter plus X experience anymore.
The whole equation is gone. The new framework says that reality has different organizational modes. Some are non-perspectival, like a rock. Some are perspectively organized, like a brain. It's a basic property of how certain systems are structured.
And suddenly, things like color, imagination, synesthesia stop being weird problems we have to solve.
They stop being anomalies. They become the natural expression of this basic structure. Of course, the system that is fundamentally organized around a perspective is going to have perspectival experiences like color. That's just what that mode of organization is from the inside.
So the huge realization here is that liveliness isn't some weird fluke that happened to matter once it got complicated. It's a fundamental way that reality can be organized, and it just so happens that biological brains are the one example we're sure of that achieves the necessary dynamic complexity for that organization to express itself.
That is the shift in framework. We've moved from trying to inject life into the universe to recognizing that perspectival organization is one of the universe's native modes of being.
Wow. Okay. That was a journey. We went from something as simple as the color of an apple all the way to reframing how we think about reality itself.
We really did. And it all hinged on that first step, spotting the category mistake.
Right. The mistake of confusing the physical description track 1, the wavelength, with the experiential description track 2, the color red. Once you make that separation, everything else starts to fall into place.
It does. You can then see that experience isn't a static thing. It's a dynamic, learned, perspectival process.
And that insight allows us to finally get rid of that old, clunky, additive model, the model that's always searching for that magic ingredient X to explain life.
And we replace it with the constitutive view, the idea that this liveliness, this capacity for experience isn't an addition, it's a fundamental way that certain parts of reality are organized.
And for you, the learner, this is so much more than just a philosophical game. This framework is incredibly practical. When you're out in the world reading about AI or consciousness or even just thinking about your own mind, you now have this toolkit.
You can start asking the right questions. Is this person mixing up categories? Are they treating an experience like it's a physical object? Are they stuck in that old additive model looking for a ghost in the machine?
Or are they asking the more interesting question? What kind of perspectival organization is required for this phenomenon to occur?
It lets you see these deep problems not as unsolvable mysteries, but as challenges in understanding dynamic, organized systems. It shifts the entire conversation.
Which leaves us with just one last thing to think about, a final provocative thought to take with you.
Let's hear it.
If this ability to experience, this liveliness, really is a fundamental, constitutive way reality is organized. Why do we assume it's only happening here in the biological systems we recognize? What if this intrinsic perspectival organization is a more general feature of the cosmos, expressing itself at different scales in different ways, maybe in forms we don't even have the concepts to recognize yet? What other things in the universe that we currently see as static and lifeless might actually be the expression of perspectival dynamics, just at a scale we can't perceive?
That is something to mull over.